the next factoring technique I wanted to cover is called the magic X method, but basically it is a way to factor our basic quadratics, ones that your very traditional algebra type of factoring scenario, where we have three terms: an x squared, an x, and a constant, and we want to try to factor them. So before we actually get into the magic X method, what I wanted to mention is there's what we call a guess and check method, which is the way that I always did it when I was younger, but I wish I had a better way of doing it. But basically, instead of like knowing or following a systematic procedure, basically just by kind of figuring it out by guessing numbers that I think might work. And it all kind of relies on the intuition, and it's basically trying to reverse a FOIL, because if I'm trying to make an x squared, I know that I'm going to need to have an x and an x to do that. And if the last term is going to be 77, I know that the other two numbers also have to multiply to be 77. So what I could then do is guess particular numbers that might multiply together, like in this case 7 and 11 multiply to make 77, and also being negative means that I know it would have to be one would have to be positive, one would have to be negative. But also the other thing that you have to be careful about when you're doing this guess and check method is to make sure that the inner product, which is the result of the other two parts, also works out. Because if I'm doing this, again, it's kind of a way of reverse foiling by guessing. I know that that makes sense, x squared. I know that that makes sense, negative 77. But the other two, again, what we call inner products, must make the inner term. And if I look at those two in red, that would be negative 7x and plus 11x. Those are like terms, so they would combine to make 4x. Notice that that's very close, but not quite right, because my inner product here should be negative 4x, not 4x. And of course I could fix this by just changing the signs on those two constants right there, and that would fix my problem and give me my answer. And that method's totally cool, but basically the magic X method is more of a strategic way of figuring it out without having to go through guessing and erasing and what I've found just from experience teaching a lot of algebra is that students often will make way more mistakes if they use the guess and check method. If they use the magic X method, mistakes are much less common. And also the magic X method can be expanded. Basically, you can solve any factoring problem, regardless of how difficult it is. And we're going to look at more and more complex examples just to see how we could apply it in those cases as we continue. But basically how it works is you're always going to take the numbers that are within the polynomial and build what we call the magic X, or sometimes it's called an X. And from you guys in whatever high school you guys went to, you may have done it a little bit differently, but most likely you've learned sort of a similar tactic, and you don't necessarily have to do it exactly this way. This is just the way I learned in some form, and it's the way I've taught it for quite a while. It's a very common method, but it's not the only method. But I'm going to use it in all my videos just for the sake of consistency. So it's just the step one is going to be to set up a magic X. And basically the X is going to help us figure out how this will factor. And on the top, you're always going to put the product of the first number and the last number. So basically negative 77 is going to go on top. And on the bottom is going to go the middle number, which we often call B. And this one we often call A and C, just like A, B, C, 1, 2, 3. I would sing, but I'm too tired. Anyways, there we have it. We put this times this on top and this on bottom. Again, make sure to include negatives when they are negative. And basically the next thing is what I'm going to try to do is solve the magic X. I'm going to look for two numbers here. Basically this is a puzzle where I'm trying to find a combination of two numbers that will multiply to make the top number and simultaneously add up to the number on the bottom. And so basically what I would recommend is always focus on multiplication first, because there's a limited number of ways to multiply two whole numbers together to get to 77. Whereas different ways of adding to get negative 4, there's an infinite number of different ways I could add up to get 4. So basically we can set this up as a process of elimination. Well, how many ways can I possibly multiply to get 7 to get 77. And actually, there's only two combinations. It's either going to be 7 times 11 or 1 times 77, because 77 is built based on just only two prime factors, so we have a very unique, very limited way of actually factoring it. Another thing that's helpful to know is that whenever the number on top is negative, the only way to make a negative by multiplying is if one number is positive and one is negative in the magic X. So we know that these two things must be opposite signs in order to multiply to make a negative number. And basically, there's only two options. It's either going to be 7 and 11 or vice versa. So technically 4 options, I guess. Or 1 and 77 or 77 and 1. And of course, at the same time, now once I've kind of been thinking about those options, I would then think about, well, which of those combinations would add up to be minus 4? And since they're opposite signs, we know that opposite signs subtract. And really, instead of adding, it's really going to be like the two numbers need to subtract. And in this case, the only combination that's going to make sense is, of course, 7 and 11. Because negative 7 times negative 11, positive 7 times negative 11 makes negative 77. And negative 7 plus negative 11 makes negative 4. And then once we've figured this out, we've now completed the puzzle. We've solved the magic X. And again, then we have solved our factorization. Then we would just put each of those into our factors, x plus the first, x plus 7, and x minus 11. And there we have it. That's the same number that we got via the guess method, but there was no guessing involved. It was a very thought out procedure for finding it. And technically, I guess you could think of it as guessing the numbers, but you can always exhaust the list of possible factors of the number on top to be at a point where you're 100% sure this will work or this will not work. Let's do one more example, and then in the next video we'll do a couple more. So again, to start off with, if let's say I wanted to solve this next one by magic X method, and if you're someone who likes puzzles, this might be fun for you, even, you know, just to solve puzzles. I know not everybody likes puzzles, but for me, I kind of enjoy certain puzzles, and these ones are kind of, especially if I have a procedure, a way of going about finding it. Sure, guessing, you know, can be fun, I guess, as well. But anyways, so again, what I would start by doing is focusing on the top and thinking about, well, what ways could I multiply to get 40? Like, I could do 4 times 10. Again, since I have a negative on top, I know I need a positive times a negative to do that. So I could think, well, maybe 4 and 10. Again, you could sketch out the numbers here as you're going, but I wouldn't write them down until I was pretty sure they're going to work. But again, those aren't going to add up to 18, so that's not, you know, that combination doesn't make sense. I could do 5 times 8. 5 times 8, that's not going to work either. And also, since the number on bottom is fairly large here, I know that the separation between these numbers has to be pretty great, meaning that one's going to be big and one's going to be small. So in this case, you know, you probably already know the answer, but because you can probably see it, but it just depends on how good you are at factoring numbers. But 20 times 2 is going to work here, because positive 20 times negative 2 would make negative 40, and positive 20 minus 2 would add up to be 18. And again, that's the idea. Always multiplying to the top, adding to the bottom. And if I've done that correctly, this should now work. X plus 20 times x minus 2. And there we have it. And again, we call it the magic X, and there's really nothing magic about it. We're really just figuring out, well, which combination will make sure that these two numbers multiply to get negative 40, which is just the third component of the FOIL, or really the fourth component. And then when we're adding them together, we're computing the inner products, where we're trying to find x times negative 2 and x times 20. Well, if I just add those two together, that will incorporate that inner product, which is exactly what I'm figuring out right there.